So I'd like to welcome you all to this online workshop, Carbon Farming and How to Get Started. This is being hosted by the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development and being facilitated by Perth NRM and Regen WA. My name is Shay Crouch and I sit as a Sustainable Agriculture Manager at Perth NRM. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all zooming in from today and pay our respects to the cultural elders of the past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their spiritual connections to country. Today I sit here on Woodchuck land where we are transitioning out of this Noongar season of Bunuroo, their second summer, into Deirdre, where the cooler weather begins. Bunuroo is the hottest time of the year, which runs from February through till March. And Deirdre is where we see a break in the heat and start seeing the dewy mornings and a change in the winds. Today's workshop, we will be hearing from well-respected and experienced DPIRD staff. Some of you may have heard from them previously. So Kerry House and Catherine Turnbull, who are online today. Each will present and then we'll answer a few questions at the end of the webinar. There was some pre-registered questions which we hope to be answered throughout the webinar as well, but if you also have more questions, feel free to put them into a chat box and I will make sure they get answered at the end of the Q&A session. Kerry will be giving an overview of carbon farming. Catherine will then go on to provide a soil project planning overview, and Kerry will return to our screens to provide a vegetation planning overview. I will ask if you feel free to have your video, you can turn your video off if you want, but we will have most of it shared screen with a presentation. So I'll now hand it over to Kerry. So Kerry House is the Program Manager of the Low Carbon Futures at DPIRD. So Kerry, feel free to share your screen. And
I shall. All right, well, thank you very much, Shay, and thank you very much to the Perth NRM team as well for your support today. It's been really great working with you, so thank you. I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us today. Good turnout. I must admit that I do find webinars a little bit odd. I like the personal touch of being able to talk to an audience in person. However, obviously COVID makes it a little bit difficult for us at the moment, obviously distance as well. So we're hoping to be able to return to our workshops in the regions as soon as we can, and hopefully I'll meet some of you at those occasions. Now, as Shay said, carbon farming is quite a big topic, and I'm conscious that it gets complicated quite quickly. So we'll try not to overload you with too much information, and Catherine and I will sort of like try and give you the main things that you need to understand at this point. But there is a lot of information around on our websites, and if you want to give us a call, we're always welcome to chat to people about their individual circumstances as well. So this is really just a bit of a big overview to give people a bit more information. So starting off, I like to talk about the fact that carbon really is more than just about reducing emissions, either avoiding them or sequestering them, but it's also a business opportunity. And it's really meeting that demand for offsets that is growing at the moment. And there's also this demand for people to be carbon neutral as well. It is important to see carbon farming as an investment, just like any other type of investment, and it requires some thought and some planning before people dive into it. And it's important also to remember that carbon is just another commodity, just like any other. It's a tradable commodity, and there are responsibilities and obligations about providing a really good quality product. And that's what these Australian carbon credit units are, as a high quality product that's got a significant value these days. Now, if you look at a modern farming enterprise, such as the one that I'm showing up here, there's a number of ways that emissions can be either avoided or sequestered. The carbon farming element of it just forms part of that overall picture of what a modern enterprise looks like. And so they can be, as I said, vegetation or soil that's storing the carbon. But it can also be things like avoiding emissions through dietary supplements and waste management, particularly for around cattle and other ruminants. And of course, when you're looking at your total business, there are other ways that you can reduce your emissions through things like alternative energy sources and so on. So the first thing that people need to really think about is why they're interested in carbon farming. Is it about carbon farming or is it about the carbon footprint? And it's important to distinguish between the two. Carbon farming, as I said, is an investment. It's about creating a tradable commodity, and it's meeting that demand for the offsets that we can see in the wider market these days. It also is leveraging external funding that allows things like salinity, soil health and loss of biodiversity to be addressed as well. So carbon farming is a business enterprise. When you're looking at the carbon footprint, and a lot of people do call us about wanting to understand what their footprints are because they're interested in their business being carbon neutral, their products being carbon neutral, that's a different sort of focus. This is really about future market demands and opportunities. It's that growing supply chain demand, and you'll see that through Woolies and Coles and others. There's expectations from consumers these days about having products that recognise their carbon footprint. And I think very soon we'll see that these types of products will go from being a premium product to being just an expectation of what is being provided to the consumer. So it's really about maintaining market share. To do the carbon footprint, there's a range of calculators out there that are being developed, some of which are international, some of which really suit the eastern states. However, we're developing one specifically for Western Australian conditions because we have so many mixed cropping enterprises here. And so once you understand what your emissions are, then that can inform your change in practices to ensure that your product is heading towards that carbon neutral status. So differences here, very important, is are you looking for a carbon farming opportunity or are you looking at your carbon footprint? They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it's just important for you to be clear about what your motivations are. So that brings us to what carbon farming is in itself. Now, this is referring to the land management activities which create carbon credits. There are specific schemes, both international and Australian, that recognise the amount of carbon that's being stored or avoided in either vegetation or soil. And they're looking at long-term storage of this carbon. So it's got to be 25 years or up to 100 years. So these are land management activities that create carbon credits. For every tonne of carbon dioxide or its equivalent, because there's methane and other gases as well, for each one of those that's stored, you can be issued with an Australian carbon credit unit for those registered projects. So these are called ACCUs for shortening purposes. Now this all fits under the Australian Emissions Reduction Fund, and this is our Australian scheme. There are other schemes that are international, and there's others in other countries as well, but this is the Australian one, and the Australian carbon credit units can only be traded in Australia. Now, these projects are registered by the Clean Energy Regulator, under which the Emissions Reduction Fund sits, and the Climate Solutions Fund does as well. And the Clean Energy Regulator also issues those carbon credit units to the proponents of these carbon farming projects. Now, ACCUs are a tradable financial product. They're considered to be a personal asset as well, which is quite interesting. You can pop them in your kids' Christmas stocking if you would like to. And they are governed by to make sure that they have integrity. So they're really important. So if someone's buying a carbon credit unit, they want to know that there's a legitimate carbon that's been sequestered. And that's very important for them to buy an asset that they feel trust in. So those ACCUs can be sold to Australian businesses to offset their greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of companies these days are trying to get climate active certification, which means that they need to reduce their emissions as much as they can. And then the ones that they can't reduce any further, then they need to offset them in some way. So that's why they're looking for carbon credits to help them with that carbon neutrality. ACCUs can also be held as an asset. One assumes that over time, demand will continue to grow and the cost or the price of those ACCUs will increase. And so they become an asset just like any other that you may have in your business. They can also be used to offset a business's emissions, assuming that they have obligations to do so. And so they're a really important tool looking into the future about how we want to be able to manage agriculture's emissions and their carbon neutrality. As I said, there are other schemes as well. So the most well-known one is the Gold Standard, which is the international one, and there's a few Gold Standard projects up in the Yarra Yarra in the northern wheat belt, and that's I think it continues to be the only one that's in Australia, but they are internationally tradable carbon credit units. That's a whole chapter in itself. Now, with carbon prices, it's all about supply and demand. At the moment, there's not a lot of Australian carbon credit units or ACCUs in the market. It's a very illiquid market. So what needs to happen over the next few years is we need to increase that supply to meet what will be a growing demand as more businesses need to offset their emissions, particularly in those hard to to offset entities. So with a limited supply, of course, and growing demand, you'll end up with an increasing price. And it's very interesting to see what happened to the spot price for ACCUs last year. Having languished for a long time around about that $16 mark, a little bit lower than that previously, it rose very rapidly last year. There was a lot of speculation in the market about what was going to happen in the lead up to the climate change conference in Glasgow. And then recently, the Emissions Reduction Fund announced that they would allow people to break their contracts and allow those ACCUs to be sold into the wider market. And so hence there's been a bit of a drop in price, but it seems to have steadied now around about the $31 mark, which is great. I think that the higher the price of those carbon credit units, the more people will be encouraged to avoid emissions, and the more lucrative it is for people thinking about starting a carbon project to get involved, because the low price has been quite a barrier for a long time. So the question is, why would you get involved in carbon farming in the first place? It's important to understand that it can provide a new diversified revenue stream. It's not a regular one, like, it's not like selling your crop, your wheat or your sheep or something like that each year and you get a regular income from it. It's a little bit more staged in it, you get income from it every few years. However, in those times when you require additional revenue, it's a good thing to have up in your pocket. The co-benefits to the farmers that go with carbon farming are also really important to think about as well. So they can increase agricultural productivity, they can improve soil health, they provide shelter belt for stock, windbreaks, they can tackle land degradation, particularly around salinity, dry land salinity and erosion, and they can restore the landscape because, of course, the wheat belt in particular has had extensive clearing over the last 100 or so years, and there's been quite a lot of biodiversity in that environment. And through our carbon farming and land restoration program, which I'll talk about in a moment, we're really looking at trying to get more biodiversity back into farming systems to produce a whole range of co-benefits. Carbon farming can also give a range of other spin-offs as well. So for instance, the new farm forestry method, you can grow oil mallees, for instance, and then that you get not only a biomass, but also biofuels that come from those as well. So there are other spin-offs other than simply the carbon offsets in themselves. And of course, then there's plantation forestry, hard and softwood, which are looking for opportunities to expand and to give us a more steady West Australian supply of wood products. So the types of projects. The Emissions Reduction Fund has got quite a range of methods, some of which don't suit Western Australia for a range of reasons. The main ones that suit Western Australia and the southwest of it, particularly are the reforestation by environmental or mallee plantings, which is the one that our program is quite interested in. There's also reforestation and afforestation, the forestry plantation ones that I just mentioned, and there's also the soil organic carbon methodology. There's one that was released at the end of last year, which is now the main one that's being used across Australia. And we're hoping to see in the next year that there'll be an integrated farm method which uses both soil and vegetation stacking so that you don't need to register them separately, and hopefully that'll remove some of or reduce some of the costs associated with those projects, because then you can have two projects over the one piece of land. There are also other types of projects. So the ones that I've been referring to and the ones in our program are about sequestration, but there's also emissions avoidance projects as well, and these ones reduce methane emissions. That's looking at dairy and cattle feed supplements. There's also effluent management and beef herd management, which is more suited to the north, where they have large herds of cattle. I think you need a minimum of 10,000 cattle as a head to make that one work. And there's none in Western Australia at the moment. So these ones are still taking a little bit of time to get off the ground. There's only, I think, one of the effluent management projects in Western Australia. And we're hoping over the next few years, as those credits start to increase in value, that there'll be more of those avoidance projects. You can see also from my little map there that in the northwest, there's also Savannah Burning, which is suited to those large areas with greater than 600 millimetres of rainfall per year. And then there's human-induced regeneration, which is across the pastoral areas. And then there's the vegetation ones and the soil projects, which are in the southwest corner. So that leads us on to the carbon farming and land restoration program. So this was announced in July last year, and we've started our first round. This is really focusing on the Southwest Land Division, where we're trying to increase the uptake of carbon farming projects, particularly in the farming landscape, to integrate those into agricultural businesses. We're looking at these because carbon farming can play an important role in both the financial side of farming, but also in the climate resilience as well. And it's a really important component of improving agricultural productivity, particularly now that we're facing more issues around climate change and the drying climate. It's also there because we're trying to encourage these vegetation projects to address the impact of that wide-scale clearing across the southwest, particularly in the wheat belt, which has, of course, increased the dryland salinity, loss of biodiversity, and is affecting the soil health. And also there's a lot of waterlogging, erosion, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the program is really trying to get projects that can help address those types of issues. There are a few barriers to the entry of the uptake of carbon farming generally, but also in Western Australia. Part of that is the financial commitments to it, particularly the upfront funding that's required for things like vegetation projects. We need to put all your trees in the ground, do the site preparation, etc. So it can be quite expensive. And then there's a delay before you'll get any credits from the CER. Usually takes around about 3 to 5 years to get that. So the financial aspects have been a bit of a barrier. We also don't have a lot of carbon farming projects in WA, and it would be really great to have more of them. So if we get more early adopters involved, then people can see how it works and they can understand how it fits into the business, and it's seen as being more approachable. There's also a lot of education and outreach that's required, so hence webinars such as this one. Now, the key principles around the Carbon Farming Land Restoration Program is really about maintaining the integrity of farming communities and the WA agriculture industry. There is, of course, always concerns that these property, like farms particularly, are going to be taken up by carbon farming projects, and it'll push out people from communities, and we'll lose our valuable agricultural land. For our program, what we want to do is we want to demonstrate that it can be integrated into the normal business, and it becomes just another commodity, and it increases the value of low productivity land. Things that's too hilly, too rocky, that's too hard to crop, for instance. At the moment, it'll have quite a low value, whereas if you could put a carbon farming across it, so revegetate it, then you in fact end up with something that's producing an asset and therefore increases the value of that particular piece of land. And again, it's all about managing that, the way that your business operates to maximise the benefits from things like that. So as I said, it's really about being a complementary activity and improving the land for agriculture, not replacing it. Now, with our program, we are really focused on environmental, social and economic benefits. And the 5 that we're really looking for in the projects that we're funding have these 5 priorities of co-benefits, which is biodiversity and conservation, agricultural productivity, soil health, salinity, and Aboriginal economic and cultural co-benefits. These have been designed to be reasonably flexible so that you can pick and choose the benefits and the criteria, the separate sections underneath each one that allows you to choose whichever one suits your particular project. And these were developed in consultation with a range of stakeholders, including DBCA and DWER. Now, the Carbon Farming Land Restoration Program has 3 streams to it. There's the ACCU Plus streams, A and B. This is so named because it's ACCU's plus co-benefits. As you can see, we spent a lot of time workshopping that. And what we're looking for is carbon with the co-benefits that give us that value for money, and it provides public benefits as well, which are really important. So these can be vegetation or soil projects in ACCU Plus A, and they need to be registerable projects under the Emissions Reduction Fund. ACCU Plus B is looking specifically at soil carbon projects. This is in the low rainfall area, under less than 350 millimetres average rainfall in that winter period. And it's really a proof of concept more than anything else. We know that a lot of farmers out there are doing some really interesting things when it comes to carbon farming, when it comes to soil carbon particularly. They've got a lot of really interesting approaches to increasing soil carbon, and we all know how important that is for our soil health and productivity. So we're really encouraging these types of projects so we can collect data and understand how some of those approaches that they're putting in place work, and we can get some genuine understanding of where they work and how it can be applied to other areas. The third stream is about future carbon. This is looking at pilots and trials so that we can identify innovative agricultural practices. We're looking for new methods under the Emissions Reduction Fund, and it's really about knowledge and research. So that's a separate stream to the ACCUs one. Going back to the ACCU Plus soil for a moment, this, as I said, is looking at the lower rainfall areas, and they're nicely hatched in there in slight purple. And these areas, in fact, for some of the projects that we selected in the first round fit into that low rainfall area. We're looking for the data and the co-benefits that go with those. We're encouraging farmers to participate, and we're really looking at covering the sampling costs and the management costs of those projects, because there's a fair amount of reporting and auditing that goes with them. And by doing that, by supporting these projects, we're really reducing the risks for the landholder, because we are sharing the risk with those proponents. And should those, after 5 or 6 years, if the proponents decide that they don't wish to continue with that project, then they can always exit the project. We've collected the data and the information that we really wanted to, and then they can decide to revoke the project with the Clean Energy Regulators, should they so desire. So it's not a long-term commitment if it doesn't work for that particular business. So how it works with the ACCU Plus is someone will design their project, they'll work out how much funding they require to get that project established, and how many carbon credit units that they would like to offer to the Rural Business Development Corporation, which administers the scheme for us. They also need to determine what the co-benefits are that go with that project and how they're going to measure and report on those. They then put forward a proposal. It goes through a fairly extensive process where we use subject matter experts, technical panels, and an investment panel to select the projects that are then funded by the Rural Business Development Corporation, which is the RBDC. So for instance, this particular project may require $150,000 for their upfront project costs. They put together a project plan. They explain how they're going to get this project up and running. It's assessed for the many benefits that go with it. And then they in turn will provide to the RBDC 5,000 ACCUs over, say, for instance, the first 5 years, could be 10 years. The person runs their project. At the end of the first 5 years, they'll need to audit and report into the Clean Energy Regulator, which will then issue the ACCUs to the project. And a portion of those selected by the proponent as to how many will then go to the RBDC. The project will continue on. Once they've discharged their obligation to the RBDC, then all future ACCUs are held by the proponent, the person that's running the project. And that, as I've said previously, they can be used as an asset. They can be sold with verified co-benefits now to the secondary market, which makes them more valuable. And that's what the Carbon and Biodiversity Stewardship Program is about, which is the federal program. And we're also looking here at future certification for sustainable, biodiverse, carbon neutral status for farms in particular. So there's a lot of work being done in that across Australia. And they can also be used to offset farm emissions. So in a nutshell, what you're doing is you're providing a small portion of those ACCUs from the life of that project to the state government through the RBDC in exchange for some funding for that project. Now, with the round 1 projects, 6 were chosen. 3 of them were soil carbon projects, 2 from the ACCU Plus B, which is in the lower rainfall areas, and 1 in the higher rainfall areas. And there were 3 vegetation projects, again in high rainfall areas and low. So it was a really interesting opportunity for us to have a look at the types of projects that were coming through and how much money was required. It gave us an idea about ACCU price, etc., and the types of co-benefits and what needs to be done in terms of measuring those. For round 2, which will start in a few months, what we're looking to do is support farmers to establish the projects, and really particularly in that wheat belt area. And so this is why we've got the Carbon for Farmers Voucher program, which finishes this week. Well, we're trying to get more farmers involved to understand what they need to do to set up a project, so it's not quite as scary, I guess you could say, as people may think it is at the moment. The other part is the future carbon, and we're going to be looking more to industry to work with growers to find some innovative ways to sequester carbon in the landscape, because that's really important as well. So that's me for the first part. Now I'm just going to hand over to Catherine Turnbull, one of my colleagues. We're both in the Low Carbon Futures team, and she's my soil support person. She also knows a little bit about vegetation as well, which is great. So I will now hand over to Catherine.
Thanks, Kerry. Welcome everybody. Thanks for attending and showing an interest in our carbon farming and land restoration program. As Kerry said, I've been tasked with really delving into the soil carbon opportunity for landholders and understanding how these projects fit within agriculture and how to get involved. So, you know, the first question really is, why start a carbon farming project? Is it just about the ACCUs? And really, for most landholders, soil health and its impact on productivity is the primary reason or motivation to undertake a soil carbon project. With the carbon credits, or the ACCUs as we call them, they would be viewed as the co-benefit of one of these projects. In this model, it's best to understand the ACCUs compared to frequent flyer points. The priority for most landholders would be investing in and improving and restoring soil health with the objective to enhance the productivity of the farm and potentially increase the land value. And the ACCUs, with the ACCUs not being the primary goal, but the frequent flyer points for you to use at a later stage. For some farmers, this may be putting them in your super even. You're actually improving soil carbon for the next generation, and those ACCUs are a little bonus on top. What the farmer does with the ACCUs is the individual farm business decision. And they can be, as Kerry said, they can be sold, they can be hedged or cancelled to offset your own farm emissions. So, sorry, Kerry, we can go to the next slide.
Okay, no.
To generate Australian carbon credit units or ACCUs, you need to be involved with the Emissions Reduction Fund. This basically involves ensuring, first of all, ensuring your land and your proposed project activities meet the regulatory eligibility criteria. This may include signed consent from eligible interest holders, such as the mortgage holder, and it may be evidence of land use for the previous 5-year period. Some types of land use are not eligible. The next step really is to undertake a project feasibility, which includes financial, technical, and legal feasibility. The key thing here is the development of a land management strategy, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Registration with the Clean Energy Regulator and receiving approval is the next step. At the moment, this is taking around 90 days to be completed through the Clean Energy Regulator. So this needs to be factored into your project timeline. The next step is really just then the implementation of your project using an approved methodology for sequestering, measuring, reporting, and then claiming your carbon credits over a 25-year period. That's called the permanence period. As with any significant long-term business decision, the planning and feasibility phase of the project is the key to success. Next. So, the new soil method is called estimation of soil organic carbon sequestration using measurement and models method. This was brought out last year. The most significant updates to the new soil method are the broadening of eligible activities to sequester soil carbon and the ability to use modelling in lieu of some direct sampling, with the objective of lowering sampling costs during the project lifetime. Soil carbon stocks must be estimated using specific soil sampling methods, that's the measurement only approach, or using a specified hybrid approach which combines soil carbon model estimates, which are then verified with soil sampling. Under the new method, there is a broader range of eligible activities. If the landholder is already implementing activities to improve soil health, they don't need to stop these. If they are already trialling one of the eligible activities but want to increase the extent to which they are doing the activity, they need to provide evidence that what they are doing is to an extent that would be considered materially different to the baseline period or your business as usual. For example, for most farmers engage in reduced tillage practices now across the wheat belt. If you were to reduce your tillage rate to 0, that would be considered materially different to your baseline activity and would make that activity one of the eligible activities on your project. The eligible activities to be undertaken to increase soil carbon are described in the Land Management Strategy document, which is required for registration with the Clean Energy Regulator. The Land Management Strategy must be updated every 5 years for the life of the project, and the eligible activities can change over time to give flexibility to increasing your soil carbon stocks. Landholders are not locked into a single activity for the 25 years. All right, so during the planning phase, this is where the bulk of the risk mitigation and financial decisions and integration with the farm business happens. The key document is a land management strategy, which basically plans the eligible activities. It identifies the eligible activities that will increase soil carbon, identifies risks that may limit or reverse soil carbon increases, and details contingency activities for maintaining that soil carbon over the 25 to 30 years. Understanding the efficacy of the activities you want to undertake on your project to increase soil carbon requires an understanding of the potential of the soil types on your property. Identifying soil types across the project area will also help you identify what's termed your carbon estimation areas. Managing your carbon estimation areas according to their capacity to sequester carbon will increase the certainty of carbon estimations and will minimise the risk of losing carbon stocks. Each carbon estimation area requires sampling using a documented sampling plan to calculate the estimated carbon sequestered per hectare. All of this is reported to the Clean Energy Regulator and will be part of the reporting that you would do to the land restoration program if you're under our program. The baseline and operational emissions of your project. Remember, the baseline is the land activities that took place in the 5 years subsequent to starting your project. So the baseline emissions and the operational emissions going forward need to be calculated for your project. And these are just calculated across the project area, not the entire farm business, just the project area you're claiming credits for. The Clean Energy Regulator requires accounting for emissions from livestock, from synthetic fertiliser application, lime application, residue and tillage events, and irrigation energy. And these are then calculated and taken off your net abatement for the project. To participate in the carbon farming and land restoration program, the co-benefits of the soil carbon project must also be identified, measured, and reported. Eligible co-benefits for soil projects include soil health, agricultural productivity, and Aboriginal economic and cultural co-benefits. So, a land management strategy. Investment in a high quality land management strategy, we believe, is the key to assessing the business case and mitigating potential project risks. Professional service providers should work collaboratively with landholders to ensure that the obligations, the risks, and the potential rewards of undertaking a carbon farming project are really well understood. As the land management strategy will inform important long-term investment decisions, it needs to be tailored to individual business goals and circumstances. It's a requirement that the land management strategy is prepared or reviewed by someone with appropriate knowledge, experience and understandings of agronomy, plant nutrition and the influence of agricultural management on soil carbon. Information on how this person meets the criteria has to be included in the land management strategy. The land management strategy is also to include a signed statement from the landholder, and each relevant landholder, if there's more than one, that they have read and agree to implement and oversee the activities outlined in the land management strategy. Our team has developed a land management strategy template also, which is available on our website for anyone that wants to look at that. Okay, next slide. Thanks, Kerry. So there are a growing number of free online tools. We certainly recommend using the CSIRO tool called Look-See. You can see it at the back there. And the Carbon Farming Foundation also has a free tool which allows you to toggle settings to allow for more scenario planning. Both of these tools allow you to look at the types of projects that would be more relevant to your land holding and allow you to calculate what your potential might be. Both are probably going to have a level of conservative calculation to them, which helps you create a buffer for your project. I think the next slide shows a chart of carbon from the Look-See. Sorry, so there's quite a lot of information available, and this is free to use, and these are reasonably easy for anyone to have a play around with. So we certainly recommend landholders have a go at doing this themselves to begin with, just to get a bit of a feel for what it is that you might be able to achieve. Next slide, Kerry. So under the land restoration, carbon farming and land restoration program, soil projects can attribute 3 out of the 5 co-benefits. Obviously, agricultural productivity and soil health benefits, as well as Aboriginal economic and cultural. These have to be accounted for, they need to be described, they need to be measured, and they need to be reported to us, and that occurs on an annual basis. We also have our own portal that you can use to identify the co-benefits that are in your project area. Again, this is a really easy to use tool, and we recommend it's on our website. We recommend that landholders go and have a play with this and have a really good look at what they think, you know, might be the options for their project area.
Thanks, Catherine.
And that's it for me. Thank you. I'll take questions at the end.
No worries. Now, Carla unfortunately is unwell today, so I will step in and do her component here, which is about revegetation projects. So right from the beginning, when we were talking about carbon farming, there's 2 of the main ways of storing carbon is either through soil, which is what Catherine's just been talking about, or alternatively through revegetation, which is either planting of trees. There's some others as well, but in this particular case, we're looking at replanting areas. Now, the method that we have developed a land management strategy for, and that we're really quite interested in from our project's perspective, is reforestation by environmental or mallee plantings method. This is the permanent forest that's composed of local native species, a mix of those, or you can use mallees as well. This uses a thing called full CAM, which is the full carbon accounting model to estimate the carbon stock. So you don't necessarily need to go and measure all the trees. It knows roughly how many hectares you've got, what type of climate you've got, what species mix, etc. And therefore it can work out how much carbon should be sequestered over the course of that 25 years. So it's quite a relatively easy way of measuring the carbon. There were some questions, and there is often questions about, can I plant an orchard, for instance, I don't know, almonds or avocados or something? and use that for a carbon farming project. Now, interestingly, the CER specifically precludes that type of thing. So if you're harvesting anything from your trees, whether they be nuts or fruit or something like that, and selling them for commercial purposes, then they're not eligible under this methodology. So it's important to keep that in mind. There's also a question about planting vines. Same thing, there's no method that covers viticulture at this point, despite the fact that they obviously are around for a really long time and they have very deep root systems. But at this moment, the Clean Energy Regulator doesn't have any methods that cover either of those. Now, going back to this particular method, the reason our program is interested in it is because of the co-benefits that go with them. They provide shelter for the livestock. They can improve pasture and by reducing wind erosion and so on. They can also improve the biodiversity in the areas. We all know how important it is for insects, particularly bees and so on, to have a great biodiverse environment or habitat around them. It also improves water quality by reducing salinity issues, etc. Now, with this particular method, you can use either tube stock or direct seeding or a combination of those. The tube stock is supplied by local nurseries using species that are endemic to your area. Seeding is a really interesting one. There's obviously pressures on collecting of seed from the local areas. DBCA, in particular, Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, has a lot of permits around collection of seed. And so we're hoping that there'll be new technology being developed to allow for the direct seeding systems that can cater for diverse native vegetation using the conventional seeding equipment. So there's a lot of work that's being done by researchers on how we can improve the success of seeding in these types of projects. You can then choose to plant them either as belts, so rows of trees, or you can do them in block planting. So it depends on the outcomes of your particular project. You might be building onto some remnant vegetation from a conservation area onto your property, in which case it might make sense to do it as a block planting, or alternatively, it might be linear belts so that you can continue your other activities like cropping and so on around them. And oil mallows in particular do work really well in those belts, the linear belts. In terms of eligibility for these types of projects, important that the area have been clear of forest for at least 5 years before the project is registered. You need to establish the legal right to run the project on that land. You need to also obtain approval. Some local government areas will require you to get approval before they'll allow you to engage in a plantation or a plantings project, particularly in the southwest. And there are restrictions on what can be done before the project is registered. As Catherine said, these projects take up to 12 weeks to be registered. And in fact, they're taking a little bit longer than that at the moment because of recent demand. So if you want to do a carbon farming project, one of the guys that I was speaking to up near Kalani, who's got a biodiverse project, said his advice to everyone was, if you're thinking about doing it, just register it. You can always decide to withdraw your registration. You've got 18 months before you actually have to start the project anyway. So it's important to get those registrations underway because, as I said, it takes a long time. There's also restrictions on what you can do before the project's registered. And this is really important. You can't do any site preparations or start the project before it's registered. It's really important to be clear on what you can and what you can't do before that registration comes through. With the land management strategies, although a land management strategy is required for a soil carbon project by the Clean Energy Regulator, we recognise the importance of proper planning when it comes to these types of projects. So we've developed a land management strategy for vegetation projects as well, and this is specific to our program. It's really, as I said, to allow people to think through all the things that need to be done when you have a project. This is a long-term investment. It's important to go into it knowing all of the risks, the obligations, but also the rewards that go with them. So making informed decisions is what this land management strategy is about. What we want to see is an integration of native vegetation into existing farm systems to improve the value of that low productivity land and also improve the connectivity in the landscape as well. And these types of projects offer that public as well as private co-benefits through salinity mitigation and so on. And this document is based on the ERF method, which you can see there, and also the method guide that goes with it. And it's really good because the Clean Energy Regulator does provide a fair number of these types of guides to help people with their projects. Now, our land management strategy for reforestation looks something like this. In fact, it does in fact look like this. You would need to establish things like your executive summary. So what are the goals of the project? Talks about the property details, where is it, what sort of rainfall zone it is. And we've got appendices to go with each of these types of things. And also there's lots of links to help you. So for instance, there's the Flora Base, there's the Native Vegetation Handbook series, etc. So they can be quite useful when you're starting to plan out these and decide what co-benefits go with them. There's digital mapping tools, which again are very useful. The Look-See that Catherine referred to can be used for vegetation as well as soil carbon projects. Full Cam, there's a link there to show you how to use it. It's a little bit more complicated than some of the others, but there are people that can do them for you. It also talks about the baseline period, what types of activities have been done on the land for the previous 5 years, what types of activities are you going to be engaging in, how many hectares, how are you going to prepare the site, are you going to spray weedicide on it, or are you going to do some other method? It's important to think about your budget too. There's lots of costs that go into these, and it's important, particularly if you're going to apply to the carbon farming and land restoration program, that you have a clear idea of what your budgeting requirements are. There's a few excluded and restricted activities that go with each of the methodologies, and this is outlined in the method that's on the links to the Clean Energy Regulator. And then we'd like them to be signed by a qualified person. So someone who can really check it and make sure you've got the right advice, that you've thought about the right things, so that you as a farmer don't feel that you're on your own with this, trying to make decisions about things that you're not particularly familiar with. So whilst the land management strategy should be done in collaboration with the farmer and the landowner, it is important that they get professional advice, which is what our carbon farming and carbon for farmers voucher program is about, is really getting some of those, the advice, professional advice that you need to support you in making some of these decisions. Now, one of the things you can do is draw a site plan. There's a nice little one that some of my team did. That's using our portal. So you can play around with the portal. It's actually quite useful in terms of creating things like this, and you can submit that with your application to the Carbon Farming and Land Restoration Program. There's a how-to guide on it as well. So it goes through step by step and shows you how to use this portal as well. And you can see, you can zoom straight into your farm and have a look at it, which is quite fun. We also have created some tools. So there's a cost calculator that goes with them as well. So it just gives you a bit of a range. So you've got something to go on. Not everyone knows all the intricacies of establishing a vegetation project. So we've created this to make it a little bit easier for you to work out some of the costs that need to be taken into consideration, particularly around things like planting and tree protection and so on, and weed control. The co-benefits that Catherine and I've both mentioned previously, particularly the biodiversity and conservation ones, have a strong emphasis on these vegetation projects. We're really looking at landscape corridors of increasing biodiversity and reducing the fragmentation that you can see across the wheat belt. The agricultural productivity and the soil health do go specifically to the soil projects, and salinity mitigation, it goes back again to the vegetation projects. The last one, interestingly, when we got our projects applications in for the last round, there was almost all of them had a link into the Aboriginal economic and cultural opportunities co-benefits, and that's a really fantastic thing to see. Because it's important for us to really learn from the traditional owners about how to use the land and to maximise their access and their knowledge about the environment and the on-country activities that they can do. So the portal that I've referred to is online. It's linked to our webpage. Very easy to navigate and go around. We've got the help, nice little help booklet that goes with it. You can zoom straight into your property and have a bit of a poke around. You can go right into the project, the property level, and you can identify things like if there's threatened species around your area, etc., whether there's any national parks, whether it's near a conservation area, etc. So it's quite a useful little tool to play around with. These ones here, again, showing you, if you click on the little buttons, you can see what it's talking about, and you can also see from a much higher level where there's areas, for instance, that are affected by salinity and so on. All right, so that's the vegetation component. Now, Carla again not being here, so I will now quickly finalise off this last section now with the planning a project. So when you're planning a project, it's really important for you to think about this really carefully. So do you want to do a soil or a vegetation project? And hopefully in the future, you'll be able to do both in the same project, but some people are actually doing a soil and a vegetation project on the one property already. That's definitely an option now. Think about the feasibility. Can you create enough carbon to make it worthwhile in terms of time, effort, and money that you might wish to invest into it? You need to check out the eligibility for CER registration. This is really important. There's lots of rules and regulations around them. They're there for quite logical reasons when you start digging around into them, but it's important that you ensure that your project can be registered and that can maintain its registration. Because what can happen is if you don't make sure all your activities are eligible, you could get to the reporting and auditing stage in year 5, and then the Clean Energy Regulator won't issue any carbon credits. So it's really important to be on top of what's required for your particular project. You need to look at the costs and the returns. As Catherine said, sometimes you need to look at ACCUs as the frequent flyer points. You don't fly for the frequent flyer points; they're just a bonus to have. And the same with look at it as the cherry on top of your of the project. It shouldn't be the only reason you do it is to make money. You also need to think about capability. Do you have the knowledge, the skills, and the resources to be able to run a project like this? We often use farm consultants for our businesses. We talk to tax accountants and others. We get their expertise in. So it's important to think about that as well, because as I said, there's some obligations and some requirements around these registered carbon farming projects that can easily trip you up. So it's important to get advice, particularly in the first stages before you become more familiar with it. The next question is about who is the proponent. This is the person that gets issued with the ACCUs. As the landholder, you really need to think about this very carefully. Do you want to be the proponent and get all the ACCUs, which logically makes sense? However, it also means you carry all of the risk. Now, there are project developers that aggregate farm, like lots of properties, they have lots of projects and they carry the risk. So you need to decide what you want to use your time for. Is it running a project, or do you just want to have the ACCUs that come to you as a consequence of that project? So there's decisions you need to think about who the proponent is. If you look through the register of all the projects across Australia, some are registered under farmers' names and others are done on farmers' properties and they're run by someone else. So it's important to think about that. The other thing is thinking about who's responsible for the tasks, like coordinating the soil sampling or the tree planting. That can take a lot of time, and again, it needs to be done correctly. So with the soil sampling, there's strict requirements around how it's done in terms of sampling plans, the depth, the randomness of the samples, etc. And with tree planting, probably not quite as complex, I would suggest, as soil sampling, but nonetheless, you need to ensure that you do them well so that you end up with a maximum survival rate. And so you really should be aiming to make sure that whoever plants those trees does so, they do it well so that you don't have to go back and replant. So it's really about the long-term integration into your wider business. So carbon farming should fit into your business and just be another component to it. And it's just the way that you look at it. Now, in terms of resources and information, the Climate Solutions Fund, which is part of the Emissions Reduction Fund as well, it's got lots of information and it's quite accessible. So you can go in there and you can check out how it works. You can look at the different types of projects. You can get some fact sheets that are really easy to look at. And it goes through a lot of information. So this is a really good site to use. I find the Clean Energy Regulator site to be just a little bit heavy, whereas this one's much more accessible. The other question we get asked a lot is about carbon service providers and project developers. Now, we're developing a directory for our Carbon for Farmers voucher programs to give people some contact details for service providers. Now, they can range from soil sampling people that can do analysis of soil sampling, but also things like tree planting, The NRMs are on there because they can provide a lot of advice around both carbon and the types of projects that you're interested in. And people can do full CAM analysis for you. So there's lots of services that can be provided you can pick and choose from. So there's a difference between a carbon service provider and a project developer. There's also project developers out there that can take you from, just start like doing the feasibility right through to selling the ACCU. So they can do your full service as well. So you need to decide how much support you require for your project. Lots of farmers say to me, oh, Kerry, can you do it yourself? And of course you can. You can manage all aspects of it, all phases of the project, right through from implementation to collect, selling the ACCUs if you wish to do that at the end, or keeping them for yourself. You just need to ask yourself, do you or the people in your business have the administration skills to be able to do that? And do you have the time to do that? Most farmers that I know are pretty busy and they don't like doing a lot of paperwork and so on unless they absolutely have to. So you need to ask yourself, how much are you prepared to commit? I liken this to having an accountant. Yes, you can do your own tax, but most of us choose not to because it's very easy to, not add the right information in. And I've had a couple of letters from the taxation department saying, Kerry didn't do it properly. And the last thing you need is to be in that sort of situation. So think about it like that. Would you do your own tax for your business? Maybe you do some of it and you get an accountant to do another part of it. If you have an investment property, are you going to go and look after the tenants and collect rent and do all those sorts of things, or are you going to get a real estate agent to do it for you? So think about it as how you want to run this part of your business. So think about how you want to use those service providers. They can be a partner. They can basically do a fee for service and they can just provide specific support as you need it, or they can run the whole project. If you are using a carbon service provider, it's really important that you make sure that you understand what's being said, what types of obligations are being put upon you, because ultimately it's your land. You'll need to protect that carbon stock, so you need to understand what obligations you've got. So then you can focus on your business of running the farm without having to worry too much about that carbon project. So understand your obligations. And as I said, you're always using expert consultants for everything else. Carbon farming shouldn't really be seen differently to that. You just need to make sure that you get the maximum return for that use of your land. So they are private businesses. So it's really important to look at their experience and their qualifications. That there's not necessarily formal qualifications for some things, but there are for others. So make sure the person that you're working with has got experience. They know what they're doing. You wouldn't get someone to, come and do your plumbing without checking them out on good old Google first. So make sure that you look for their experience and their qualifications. They can help you with everything from planning, feasibility, carbon estimation, registration and auditing, all sorts of things, soil sampling, etc. And they also often have links to other carbon-related advice, so legal advice and financial, because they are a little bit different to what some of the accountants and consultants are used to. Think about whether you want to do it as a fee for service or as a percentage of the ACCUs. Some companies will take anywhere from 5 to sometimes 30% of the ACCUs. The number of ACCUs that they take should reflect the amount of commitment and risk that they're taking on behalf of you, the landowner. Having a little bit of skin in the game is important because it incentivizes them to make sure that project runs well, because they're going to get something out of it. So that's really important to think about. It's not necessarily a bad thing if they're taking a small number of those ACCUs, because it means they want to make sure that they definitely produce those ACCUs. Whereas someone, if they're doing just fee for service, can walk away and leave you to it. So have a think about how this works for you. So the things to note here is that, as I said, the higher the percentage of the ACCUs, the more risk and responsibility that they should carry. If anyone's providing you with any sort of financial advice, they need an Australian Financial Services licence, and they should also have public indemnity insurance because they are providing you with advice. Wouldn't go to your accountant without making sure that they're a member of the CPA or whatever. They must have public indemnity insurance to protect you if should anything go wrong. We also insist that carbon service providers that are involved in projects under the Carbon Farming and Land Restoration Program must also be signatories to the Carbon Market Institute's Industry Code of Conduct. The reason we do that is because we think it's important in an emerging market, in a developing market, that there's integrity and that there's somewhere for consumers to go and make complaints should they wish to, and get advice regarding any of the activities that are undergoing. So if you've got any concerns, you've got someone to go to. And we work quite closely with the CMI and they're fantastic. The last bit there is the directory that I referred to. Catherine is putting that together for us, and thank you, Catherine, for doing that. It's really great to see so many people that are interested in sharing their knowledge and experience with people and wanting to be on our list. So that will be updated regularly, and again, that's on our website. So this brings us to the very last bit, frequently asked questions. And people ask me these questions all the time, so hence I've put some together for you. First question is, what happens if I sell my farm? Now, the good thing about carbon farming projects is that they can take land which would probably previously have been quite low in value and give it an actual measurable value. You can talk about how many tonnes of carbon dioxide are being sequestered on that block of land each year. It has a value to it. Now, when you register a project, the Clean Energy Regulator will notify the Lands Office, but they won't necessarily put a caveat on the land. There are quite a few carbon farms that are put on titles so that they are protected. If you have got a farm and you're the proponent, you are the person that needs to maintain those carbon stocks for that permanency period, which is 25 years. It can be 100 if you want to. Now, if you want to sell the land, the buyer has to agree to maintain that carbon farming project. Now, they may or they may not want to. Hopefully into the future, people will go, excellent, I can do that, and I'll continue reaping the benefits of that. If, on the other hand, the buyer says that they don't want to maintain that carbon and they don't want to continue that project, then as the seller of the land, you would need to return any carbon credit units that have been issued to that project back to the Clean Energy Regulator, because you can't maintain the obligation of that permanence around the carbon. So it's important when you're planning your project, if you decide that you really do want to have a carbon farming project, you've got to think ahead. Will you still have that property? Will your family still have that property in 25 or 30 years' time? If the answer to that is more than likely, then you can start moving on to the next step. If the answer is, I'm not really sure, about to retire, not really sure about my kids, then that's a conversation that you need to have with them and really think very carefully about it, because it is a long-term commitment. Second question we get asked a lot is, can I get paid for remnant vegetation or for the trees I've already planted? ERF projects require you to use new plantings. So if you planted the trees already and you haven't registered a project, then they're not eligible under the Emissions Reduction Fund. It doesn't mean that they don't have value. Into the future, I can see that there will be credits for biodiversity and lands and agricultural stewardship, and they're being developed at the moment. So the plantings that people have done in the past, I know that my dad and mum did a lot of plantings in the 80s and 90s to do some against salinity. So they wouldn't necessarily they won't get any credits for them from a carbon perspective. They've gotten a lot of co-benefits from it over the years, and that hopefully into the future they will have a biodiversity credit that goes with those. You may wish to develop a vegetation project that enhances the plantings you've already got. So it might be that you've already got some plantings there, say 50 hectares, you expand it out to 150, and that means that you would get the advantage of having a ready-made seed bed, which you can use for your plants to increase your carbon stocks. And you can also expand out your project, etc. So it might be simply that you enhancing the remnant vegetation by planting more around it. You might create landscape corridors, etc. So the upshot is, no, you can't get paid for remnant vegetation or the trees that you've already planted, but they still have value and hopefully into the future increasing so. Another question is, can I just clear the land and do a carbon farming project? So some people said, oh, Kerry, plant all these trees, they're not worth anything. Can I just knock them down and then plant some more? Clean Energy Regulator's onto you with this one. So what they insist is that the area can't have been cleared within 5 years. So if you cleared it now, you'd have to wait for 5 years before you could plant any trees there for a carbon project. And there are soil carbon restrictions as well. So Catherine can probably speak to that better than I, around some people wanting to clear a land and then start a carbon project. There's some restrictions around that as well. Now, the whole purpose behind that, of course, is to stop the loss of carbon. Because if you chop down or you clear an area, you're releasing emissions into the atmosphere. And that's the last thing that the Clean Energy Regulator wants to see. So that's why there's restrictions around clearing. The last one that comes up a bit is loss of carbon from fires. Now, fires, of course, are a natural part of our wonderful Australian landscape. Each of us would like to think that we could stop every fire that comes through our property, and having had one go through a few years ago of our place, they are quite stressful and difficult. Now, you can't insure against fire for carbon farming projects, not at the moment at least. There was some work being done on that sort of thing, but I don't think there is any insurances at the moment. What you need to do, however, is you need to show that you have done a reasonable fire risk management. You would do that anyway because it's a valuable asset. You wouldn't just leave it in your paddock exposed to a fire. So you would need to protect things like your vegetation projects and even carbon projects from fire. Now, after those fires in the eastern states in 2020, a lot of carbon farming projects were destroyed. And so they really need to think about the guidance that went with those. So if there is the event of a naturally occurring bushfire and you've undertaken all reasonable fire risk management and the fire was not your fault, then you're not required to relinquish the ACCUs, providing you can replace that carbon stock loss. Now, you might need to do some replanting. It might be a case of waiting for a few more years, adding to the end of your project to allow the land or the trees to regenerate. It might be something like that. However, if it's a total loss, then you would need to return those ACCUs that have been issued to the project back to the Clean Energy Regulator. But they are trying to be reasonable about that fire risk because, of course, it's obviously a risk for anyone with a tree project, as demonstrated down south in Denmark and other places this year. There is a really good guidance on the Clean Energy Regulator's website about fire, so you can have a read through that. The other question is, what happens if the carbon level drops? Now, this is particularly relevant for soil carbon. Soil carbon is dependent on the existing carbon levels. It's also dependent on soil type, management history, the prevailing weather conditions, whether there's a drought, additional rains, etc. Obviously, soil carbon is going to vary over time. The other thing is if you start at a relatively low base and you start increasing your soil carbon, it'll plateau relatively quickly. It doesn't continue growing up in a linear fashion. Vegetation stocks rise more steadily. And if you plant a tree and it starts off this big, in 10 years time, it'll be a couple of meters tall. Obviously, you've stored a lot of carbon in that time. So there's a relatively rapid increase in carbon over those first 10 to 15 years. And then that too tends to plateau over the last few years once those trees reach their maximum height, depending on species, etc., of course, as well. Now, looking particularly at soil carbon, if you were to have a drop in your carbon stocks, then people worry about the fact that they'll have to pay back the carbon credit straight away. Now, as I said, it's a biological system, it varies. So what would happen in this particular situation that I've got here, my beautifully drawn graph, if the project starts in 2021, you can see that there's an increase in the carbon levels, a little bit of a slowdown at around about 2024. Then it continues increasing. Now, at the 5-year mark, the project is audited and reported on, and carbon credits are issued by the Clean Energy Regulator. Now, something happens, and in the next couple of years, to after 2026 down to 2027, there's a drop in the carbon levels. Could be for a whole range of reasons. Maybe there was a small fire, maybe it was a really dry year, something's happened. Now, Over time, that carbon stocks will start to increase again. And so they'll eventually, you can see where my straight line is across there, it'll eventually reach the level that it was back in 2025, 26. Once it gets past that and it starts going up again, then you can be issued with carbon credit units again in 2030 because there's been an increase from 2025. Now, the only issue is if you can't ever return that level back to what it was. So it's always really important for farmers in particular, but anyone doing a carbon project, is to make sure that they hold their carbon credits until they're really sure that the project is going well, that they have confidence in it. There's nothing sudden like, suddenly you decide that you're going to sell the property and all those sorts of things. So you should always retain them as much as for as long as you can. Once you get to the end of your 25-year permanence period, those carbon credits are all yours and you can sell them and do whatever you like with them at that point. You can imagine in 25 years, that price will be much higher than it is now. So look at it as a long-term asset. It's really important. Now, the last slide, here we go. So finally, it's really important to prepare to be involved, whether it be in carbon farming or the carbon farming land restoration program. As we've said a number of times now, it's a long-term investment. It's really important to be informed, review all the information that's available. If you do a Google search, you'll find lots of information. There's lots of people out there that will tell you lots of things. We all like to do our online research and find out things. Our web pages have got heaps of resources and all of us are very happy to sit on the phone and have a chat if you've got specific questions. It's really important to talk to your agronomists, financial and legal experts, because again, you're going into a long-term investment. It's important to go in with your eyes open and particularly always ask for legal advice. If you're having a contract waived in front of you, don't sign anything until you're really sure that you want to do that. Sometimes developers will do a feasibility study for you and they'll expect you to sign up with them. So you need to make a decision, do you want to do that or not? The NRMs have got extensive experience from the past around carbon. They also know your area really well. They're very good at providing advice, particularly around tree planting and soil projects as well. And the Grow and the Land Care groups can also provide advice as well. So have a think about the different types of methods, which carbon farming method is right for you. Think about the eligibility components, make sure that the project is eligible, that it's new and that the activities haven't started before you've registered that project. Think about additionality. It can't just simply be business as usual. As Catherine said, it's about materially different activities if you're doing soil. Sometimes you hear people say, oh, farmers should get paid for the things they're already doing. Already doing it, it's not eligible. So it's got to be much more and new if you're going to get carbon credits to go with soil projects in particular. They also can't be projects that or things that are already done. So if you already planted the trees, it's not eligible. There's the permanence obligation. There are projects that are 100-year project permanence periods. They're particularly for those vegetation projects. The reason they do that is because if you do a 25-year project, you get a 20% discount on the number of ACCUs that you're given by the Clean Energy Regulator. They're discounting it because you're not giving a really long period of permanence for that storage of carbon. The next one is the project obligations, the auditing and the reporting. Auditing needs to be done by someone like EY or PwC or one of those big auditing, big accounting firms. So it can be quite expensive. There's also the costs of changing your practice. Soil carbon projects in particular, they don't really think about where am I going to get the seed from? How much is it going to cost me? How much is it going to cost me to change the practices that I'm doing? That's a really important thing to take into account. So things like adding organic material to your soil or changing your pasture levels, they all take work, they all take time, and they also take money. So be really clear on how much it's going to cost you to do those things. And the same with vegetation projects. How much is it going to cost you to maintain control weeds, keep your fire breaks up, etc. Next one is the eligible interest holder consents. As Catherine said, if you've got a mortgage on your property, then the banks will need to sign off on it. Sometimes people have family trusts and lots of members of the family who all have an interest in the property. They need to all give their consent, etc. So that anyone that's got an eligible interest in that land and what happens to it over the long term may need to provide their consent for that project to go ahead. The other thing you need to do is think about how many ACCUs will be generated. That look-see tool that Catherine talked about is a nice, easy one of doing it. It's a little bit rough and ready at times, but at least it gives you a bit of an idea. And there are others online now, some free, some you have to pay for. You know, as with all things, you get more when you pay more. So have a think about how serious you need to be and how much advice you really need to get. There are some very good tools out there that are available now for a relatively modest fee. And there are independent consultants that can work it out for you as well. And it's always important when you're doing these things to leave yourself a buffer. Don't go, blue sky everything and think that the price is going to be $65 in 5 minutes. Think about being conservative in your estimates so that you get surprise on the upside, not disappointment on the downside. And the last one is those land management strategies, the templates that we've made. Whilst we've developed them for the voucher program, the Carbon Farmers Voucher program that's finishing on Friday, they will be there for anyone to use at any time. And there are lots of businesses that will actually provide those types of strategies for you as well. So make sure you do all that planning effectively first. And as I said, there's lots of resources. We've got heaps of resources on our Carbon Farming Land Restoration Program page. There's the Look-See, there's the Climate Solutions Fund that I referred to earlier, which has got lots about methods and requirements. Carbon Market Institute, which is the peak body for the industry, has lots of information about projects and so on. And then there's lots of new players coming on as well that will be able to provide mapping tools and advice and so on. All right, so I think that's enough from me. So I will now.
Thanks, Kerry and Catherine. I think that was really good. There was lots of good information and definitely learn a lot. And I think the frequently asked questions at the end sort of stole some of the questions that I had in mind, but that's good. There were still a lot of questions that came through on the chat and I think beforehand. So I just want to, we've got a few minutes. I'd like to cover off on a few with them ever so briefly if possible. So someone asked, can a project begin as one type, such as vegetation, and then be updated to include others like soil in the future?
Yes. So at the moment, what you can do is you can register one. So I know someone has registered a soil project and then they've registered a vegetation project on the same property. So yes, you can do that. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. I think you've sort of really easily covered off on this one. So anything previously planted can't be considered, but can you put, I suppose, lots of smaller projects, like lots of different project sites together as one project?
Well, there's probably two questions there. So the first question is, can you use trees that have already been planted? Not for carbon farming. However, there will be credits like biodiversity credits that will be coming along in the future. So they're looking at agricultural stewardship. So if you type in, into Google ag stewardship, then you'll find on the federal government's page, I think it's Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, there's lots of information on there about how we can encourage farmers to protect our remnant vegetation and the vegetation that's already there. So that's the first part. The one about aggregating lots of projects, I think is what that second part of the question is. You can do that. So you can have, so for instance, if you've got 3 farms, you might be able to have a project that covers all 3 from different areas. So yes, you can do that. They don't have to be on the one property, they can be across multiples.
And even if they were on the same property, but not in the same
no, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. So you would make your whole property boundary, your project boundary, and then those sections would become your carbon estimation areas.
Oh, yeah.
So yes, they don't need to be joined up. They can be separate. So if I'm thinking about a normal farm, you might have a gully line that's got lots of trees on it. So you might want to connect up a couple of those and plant them out so there's more trees. You might want to produce a corridor across some of those paddocks to slow the water down in the environment, something like that. So then you can have a bunch of them that go across your whole property. So it doesn't have to be it's not like a paddock that needs to be all contiguous. It doesn't have to be in the same one. It can be all over the place.
Yeah. So there's a question around sandalwood. So I'd like to ask about woody crops with other market values, such as sandalwood. Can these
sandalwood does actually have its own methodology, but I don't know a lot about it, to be honest with you. But yes, there is something to do with sandalwood because but I don't know a lot about it, to be honest. So I can take that question on notice because I don't know a lot.
Okay, cool.
So sandalwood is, as I think, considered a little bit different to other crops. So for instance, I don't know if you planted a whole bunch of orange trees, for instance, and you're using them for commercial purposes, or almonds or something like that. Commercial types of trees aren't considered within the methodologies, but I'm thinking sandalwood's a little bit different.
Yeah, okay, because there was a couple of questions around that, so maybe if we could get a response.
Yeah.
Them through to you. So Murray's just asked now, any idea when the WA farm carbon emissions calculator is expected to be released?
I'm not sure exactly. I haven't spoken to Mandy Curnow about that recently. I know that they've been doing a lot of work on it, and it should be relatively soon, but I'm not sure. So Mandy Curnow, who's in the department, she's down based in Albany. She'd be the best person to ask about that.
Okay, cool. So regarding those plantations again, someone mentioned, as I understand, historical plantations can be used if they're being converted to a permanent planting, such as 100 years. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. So there's been some changes around the plantations method to allow that. So I don't know a lot about the plantation methods, but I know that they can be converted across.
Yeah. Cool.
That does actually happen sometimes. So what will happen is people will register a project under a method, and then a new one might come along. So for instance, the new soil carbon methodology, there was one previous to that, the 2018 method, and now most people are moving across to the new one. So that does happen.
Yeah. So I just want to let everyone know we are sending out a bit of a Survey Monkey questionnaire to get some feedback on everything, and there's an opportunity in there to add more questions if you didn't get them answered today, which we'll follow up because I know we are heading on to 11:30. But I thought this one was really interesting. Can a revegetated area be pruned, or the leaf litter, dead trees, branches be collected and converted to biochar and put into the soil?
I think my understanding of revegetation projects and the way that the carbon stock is calculated in full CAM is that it takes into account the dead wood as well. So any of the litter that's on the ground, any of the fallen branches, that kind of thing are actually accounted for. I don't know the full details about fire management. So if you're removing some of that for fire management, is possible, and it might be that you have to account for that when you do your next full CAM calculation.
Yeah, you do.
In terms of the addition of biochar to your farm, that would have to come under the soil carbon methodology. So it wouldn't be part of your revegetation methodology. It would be a distinctly different project. It would be soil carbon. And biochar can be used, but there's restrictions around where the feedstock for the biochar comes from, but it is allowable under the agricultural carbon in soil sequestration method.
Yeah, it's important to be careful. So there's a range of eligibilities and complications. So as Catherine said, when you're doing full CAM, it assumes the tree growth, but also dead litter, branches, et cetera, as well. So it's important to, think about it as a whole thing. So I don't think there's a hard and fast yes or no. I think it just really depends on how much, how often, those types of things.
Yeah. Are truffle trees classified as commercial? Because they would truffle trees. So obviously, harvest the truffles underneath, but the trees will be in the ground for a long period of time.
Yeah, because you'd be using oaks and things like that for that, wouldn't you? It would depend whether the trees fitted into an actual method. So for instance, the environmental plantings one we were just talking about is native trees specifically. The plantation and the new forestry plantation methods are obviously that you're harvesting the whole tree. So there's a they grow, they're harvested, they grow, they're harvested. So that's why they're long term. There is forestation and afforestation methodology, but I don't know that I think it would only be looking at the fruits and the nuts above the ground. So I don't think the truffles would be a problem. But again, read the method really carefully, choose the one that's right for it, and then you can go from there. That's where the Climate Solutions Fund page is useful. If you go to how it works projects, you can go and look at each one, and it's got a basic guide and a more detailed one, and it'll tell you what is and isn't allowed to be done.
Yeah.
I think, Shay, just on that, so I have a feeling that the trees themselves couldn't be part of a sequestration in vegetation project. However, you can do a soil project under the oaks. So it might be that the preparation that you do prior to planting, and then the maintenance of that soil carbon stock can be a soil carbon project.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Someone commented that the tools presented looked really cool, really good. But has there been any discussions with the Southwest Timber Hub and the decision tree tool that they have developed that provides information about carbon and plantation revenues alongside agricultural revenue streams?
I'm aware of that tool, but we haven't put it onto our website. Mainly, the worst excuse of them all, we just haven't had time. We've with the first round of our program, and then all of the following on of that, and then the Carbon for Farmers voucher program, I have to admit that we've been running pretty fast in the last 12 months. So, but I am aware of that tool. I have actually had one of my team, Kim Brooksbank, have a look at it. And it's a really interesting tool. As I said, there are lots of really interesting things out there now, but the timber one is a very interesting one, particularly for those people that are interested in a plantation project as opposed to one that we're looking for in our program. And that's a great tool to use for that.
Yeah. When you're talking about the different service providers and things and the land management strategies that farmers would need to do as part of the project, do you guys as a DPIRD team and staff like a soundboarding, like do you guys assist with some of those planning, those strategies, or can farmers?
No, we've developed them for the carbons, like for the service providers to help the farmers with. When you start having a look at them, there's a lot of things that farmers will be able to answer off it, for themselves, because they know their land better than anybody. Then there are some things you need to go and get a specialist advice from after that. But if you did have questions, then Catherine and the rest of the team and I would be more than happy to answer them. But we won't be involved specifically with them, because I think it's important that people get independent advice, and that they can then use that person over the length of the project too, which is also another important thing, to have that relationship with someone that really can focus their energy on that and their expertise on that more than anything else.
Yeah, that's good to know. I'll squeeze in one or two more questions before we finish up, I think. If you aggregate a number of native vegetation sites into one project, do you need to plant all of those sites within a certain period of time, or can you spread the risk and plant over a number of seasons?
You've got 18 months before a project needs to start, and I think that there is some limitations on when you can do the planting, but I know that with planting projects, you might do seeding and then some tube stock or combination, so there's a little bit of leeway in that. So I think obviously the conditions of the time are important, but again, there's some restrictions on just how long you can do that. I think once the project's mostly been done, I think you can't add too many more trees to it, but I'm not really sure. I mean, it sort of depends. If you've got an aggregation across a number of properties in a relatively similar area, they're probably going to have similar types of conditions, but you do have 18 months after registration before you need to start the project. And starting the project might simply be site preparation, ordering your trees, and doing a few other bits and pieces like that. So you can then time your plantings according to how good the season is.
I had a livestock question. Any plans to review the 10,000 head herd size of the beef management plan, as the threshold is quite limiting for much of WA?
Oh yeah, the beef herd method is designed specifically for the really large herds, and what they're trying to do is for the particularly in the north of Australia, where they have very large herds of animals. The more animals you've got, the greater the emissions that come with them, and so it's really about managing the age of your stock, etc., etc. So and the person who said that is quite right. There are no projects in WA that use that beef herd method. It's very difficult to do, because you can imagine having a giant pastoral lease of hundreds of thousands of hectares trying to keep track of all your cows, and you know, and trying to make sure that they're the right age, etc., and managing them really is really quite difficult. So although there are people interested in that beef herd method, it's not particularly practical at this point. On this, the good side though is the Clean Energy Regulator is very keen on developing new methods, and that sort of thing, and particularly around the release of methane from agriculture, is becoming more and more of a pressure point. So hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll see methodologies that are more suited to the more intensive beef and other, stock grazing, which hopefully will be more suitable. It all comes down in the end to scale. Like if you've got a couple of 100 head, then you're obviously not producing as much methane as if you've got 20,000 head. So it's really looking at that.
Okay.
Sheep grazing. Oh, is sheep grazing permitted? Yes, you can use animals to graze your the grasses and things underneath the trees. You just need to make sure you protect trees from them so they don't ring bark them.
There was also a question around the voucher program. Are you, if you get given a voucher, you're able to use it across multiple service providers to get the information that you need? Yes,
you can. Yeah, you can. Cool. So we've tried to make it reasonably generous so that it should cost you around about the 5,000 mark for it, depending on the size of the property, of course, for a land management strategy. But then you'll have some of that money that you can use for potentially someone to do the carbon estimation and a few other bits and pieces. So you should be able to bolt on some of those things as long as they're related back to the production of that really robust land management strategy, and it should all tie into that. The program guidelines and the land management strategies describes that a bit. So yes, you might need to use maybe 2 or 3 different people to give you the advice that you need to develop a really great land management strategy.
Cool. I might leave it there for the questions and everything today, if that's all right. Really appreciate you guys presenting and everyone actually participating in today as well. As mentioned, there's a bit of a Survey Monkey link that we'll send out to everyone to get a bit of feedback, and there's an opportunity there to ask further questions and we can get them answered by Kerry and Catherine as well. This whole webinar is being recorded and we'll get it uploaded online, and we'll share the link with everyone so you can go back and look at it and get some more details if you need. Again, really appreciate everyone participating, especially Kerry and Catherine for giving us such good information. Thanks again.
Well, thank you very much, Shay, and thank you to everyone that came along today, and thanks to Catherine for supporting me in this. It's been great, and I really appreciate everyone's time, so thank you. Yeah,
and we hope that we can sort of continue this sort of conversation going, especially for those who are wanting to get those carbon projects up and running. So please be informed or keep in touch, and we'll make sure that you guys are aware of anything that's coming up as well.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you, Shay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jay.